An American fighter pilot ejected over central Iran and described something to intelligence officials that nobody in the room quite knew what to do with. Not a missile lock, not a radar warning, not the usual chaos of getting shot down over hostile territory. He described drones, dozens of them, hovering and moving together in perfect unison. Smaller drones tucked beneath larger ones like tentacles hanging off a body, the whole formation pulsing and shifting as one connected organism in the sky, moving with a kind of coordination that shouldn't have been possible for anything Iran was previously credited with fielding. Intelligence officials who sat through that debrief reportedly called it real alien stuff. And once the account leaked out through CNN a couple months later, the internet did what the internet does and gave it a name that stuck instantly: the jellyfish drone swarm. And here's the thing. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory floating around a corner of the internet. This is a documented intelligence debrief from a rescued combat pilot that triggered a genuine, fierce internal debate inside the American defense and intelligence community about whether Iran just quietly leapfrogged into a category of drone warfare that almost nobody thought Tehran had access to. Let's rewind to how this actually happened, because the sequence matters a lot here. On April 3rd, 2026, an American F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down over central Iran, and it marked the first confirmed loss of a manned U.S. fighter aircraft over Iranian territory during this entire conflict, a milestone that sent a wave of concern through military circles well before anyone outside a small circle of officials had heard the first word about jellyfish-shaped drone formations. Both the pilot and the weapons systems officer ejected, and in a genuinely remarkable rescue operation, Special Forces got the pilot out within hours, while the weapons systems officer evaded capture on the ground for more than a full day before being successfully extracted, moving and hiding across hostile territory with search efforts closing in the entire time. That rescue alone is its own story of raw competence under extreme pressure, 2 American aircrew surviving deep inside hostile territory and both making it home. But it's what the pilot reported during his post-rescue intelligence debriefing that turned this from a straightforward, if dramatic, combat loss into something that's been quietly rattling around the Pentagon and the wider defense analyst community ever since. According to 4 separate sources familiar with that debrief, the pilot described multiple Iranian drones hovering in the air, moving as one, in a formation that resembled a jellyfish, smaller drones positioned below larger ones, almost like legs trailing beneath a body. One source described it slightly differently, saying the pilot referred to it as a minefield of drones, layered and dense enough that it felt less like a formation and more like an obstacle field hanging in open air. Neither of those specific phrases came directly from the pilot himself in public reporting. They came filtered through officials who sat in on the debrief, which is worth keeping in mind. But the broader shape of the account has been consistent across every version that's leaked out. What the pilot was describing, whether he used those exact words or not, was coordinated, synchronized movement across a large number of separate drones, the kind of behavior that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen with drones operating independently on separate remote controls. That distinction is really the whole story here, so let's slow down and actually explain what makes this technically significant instead of just visually creepy. The term analysts have used to describe what the pilot may have witnessed is one-to-many meshed networking, and it's worth understanding exactly what that phrase means because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting in this entire debate. In a traditional drone operation, even a large one, you typically have one operator controlling one drone, or at best one operator managing a small handful of drones through separate individual links, each drone effectively flying its own mission with only loose coordination between them. Meshed networking is a fundamentally different architecture. It allows multiple drones to share data with each other directly, drone to drone, not just drone to operator. So the whole group functions more like a single distributed organism than a collection of individually piloted vehicles. If one drone in that network gets shot down or loses its link, the others don't fall apart. They redistribute the workload and keep functioning as a coordinated whole, adapting in real time to whatever losses or obstacles show up. That's the capability that, until this incident, American intelligence had not assessed Iran as actually possessing. And that's exactly why this account set off alarm bells the way it did. Iran has spent years building out a large, genuinely capable drone program. That part has never been in serious dispute. Everyone from the Pentagon to independent open-source analysts has tracked Tehran's drone development closely for the better part of a decade, largely because Iran leaned into unmanned systems specifically as a hedge against its own conventional military inferiority against far more advanced adversaries, a strategic choice that traces back to the earliest days of sanctions. Air isolation, when building a modern manned air force, simply wasn't a realistic option, and cheaper unmanned alternatives filled that gap instead. Quantity, cost, and asymmetric disruption have always been the core of Iran's drone doctrine. Cheap, mass-produced systems that can overwhelm expensive defenses through sheer volume. But building a lot of drones and building drones that can autonomously coordinate into a single self-organizing formation, maintain that formation under combat conditions, and adapt as a networked whole when individual units are lost, that's an entirely different tier of technical sophistication, the kind of capability that's historically been reserved for a small handful of the most advanced militaries in the world. If Iran has genuinely crossed into that territory, it changes the entire calculus for every pilot flying over Iranian airspace. And for that matter, for every military planner trying to figure out how you defend against a threat that doesn't behave like anything currently in most defensive playbooks. Before we get further into what this actually means strategically, it's worth pausing to say, if this kind of deep dive into what's really happening behind a viral military story is useful to you, drop a like on this one and subscribe, because there's a lot more nuance underneath this jellyfish story than most of the coverage floating around online has actually captured, and it's worth walking through carefully, rather than just reacting to the headline. Now, let's talk about who's actually reacting to this and how, because the response from experts outside government has been almost as interesting as the account itself. Emma Bates, a drone warfare and defense modernization expert who founded a company called Kachai, gave what's become the most widely quoted reaction to this entire story. And it's worth hearing the actual substance of what she said, rather than just the headline version. She laid out a very specific chain of conditions, saying that if a drone swarm can coordinate itself into a recognizable shape and hold that shape, if it's carrying explosives on board, and if it's deliberately holding some of its force in reserve, specifically to finish off whatever the first wave of the attack failed to destroy, then you are looking at an extremely capable approach to warfare, one that would justify enormous investment to defend against. And that's a genuinely important framing, because notice she didn't say Iran definitely has this capability. She laid out the conditions under which this would represent a serious threat, and left the actual verification question deliberately open. The kind of careful conditional language that tends to get flattened out the moment a story like this starts circulating widely online. She went further too, saying flatly that if this capability is real, defending against it is going to cost enormous sums of money and consume enormous resources, essentially describing an arms race that the United States would have no choice but to enter if the threat is confirmed, one that would likely touch everything from sensor networks and interceptor programs to how future fighter aircraft themselves are designed and defended once airborne. That careful, conditional framing from outside experts stands in pretty sharp contrast to how this story exploded across social media and less careful corners of the internet, where the jellyfish drone swarm got treated almost overnight as confirmed fact, a settled, verified new Iranian superweapon. And that's exactly where the honesty check needs to come in, because the actual reporting on this has always been more careful than the viral version. The account remains formally unverified. It has not been definitively linked to the actual loss of the aircraft. In fact, a separate and competing explanation exists and has been reported independently, with sources telling NBC News that the F-15E was probably struck by a Chinese-made shoulder-launched missile rather than brought down by any kind of drone engagement at all. Those two explanations aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. A jet can be hit by a missile while drones are also present in the area doing something else entirely. But it does mean the clean, simple narrative of drones swarming a fighter jet out of the sky isn't the confirmed cause of the actual shootdown, at least not according to everything that's been reported publicly so far. There's another detail worth sitting with here too, and it's the kind of thing that good analysts pay close attention to precisely because it cuts against the sensational version of the story. Both Iranian and Russian officials have stayed almost entirely silent on the technical specifics of this account, and that silence has been read two completely different ways by different analysts. One camp argues the silence is itself suspicious, a deliberate effort to preserve operational surprise, because if Iran genuinely has fielded a breakthrough drone versus aircraft capability, the last thing Tehran would want to do is confirm the details and hand adversaries a head start on countering it. The other camp argues the silence is just as easily explained by the account simply not being accurate, that there's nothing to confirm because the capability being described doesn't actually exist in the form the pilot may have perceived it, and a government doesn't need to craft an elaborate strategic silence around a story that's already unverified and speculative to begin with. Both readings are plausible, and honestly, that's the most accurate way to describe where this entire story sits right now. Genuinely plausible on both ends, with the actual truth sitting somewhere in a fog that hasn't been resolved by anything publicly available yet. It's also worth putting that April 3rd shootdown into the broader context of how this conflict's air war has actually unfolded, because a single aircraft loss, while genuinely significant, sits inside a much larger picture of contested airspace that's evolved considerably since the fighting began. Iran entered this conflict with a layered air defense network built around a mix of older Russian-supplied systems and domestically produced surface-to-air missiles, a network that's been degraded substantially over months of sustained suppression campaigns, targeting radar sites, missile batteries, and command infrastructure up and down the country. Losing a single F-15E to hostile action after that much sustained suppression work is notable precisely because it suggests whatever brought that aircraft down wasn't simply an old, already mapped, already targeted air defense system doing what it was designed to do. It was something that either evaded detection entirely or represented a genuinely different category of threat that existing suppression doctrine wasn't built to anticipate. That's part of why the jellyfish account got taken as seriously as it did inside the intelligence community. Not because a single anecdote is normally enough to trigger a full reassessment on its own, but because it arrived at a moment when officials were already trying to explain how a heavily degraded, extensively mapped air defense network still managed to bring down a modern fighter jet. Let's talk about why Iran, even setting the jellyfish specifics aside entirely, would plausibly be in a position to attempt something like this in the first place. Multiple sources cited in the original reporting indicated Iran has been receiving drone development assistance from both China and Russia, though the actual scope of that assistance remains unclear and hasn't been independently confirmed in detail. That's not a new relationship either. Iran and Russia in particular have had a deeply intertwined drone relationship for years now, one that's arguably flowed in both directions over time. Iran supplied Russia with Shahed-style attack drones and complete manufacturing blueprints that Russia then used to build its own massive domestic production facility, reportedly now capable of turning out well over 1,000 modified attack drones a day using Iranian-derived designs. It's entirely plausible that some of that technical relationship flows back the other way too, with more advanced networking, sensor, or autonomy technology moving from Russia or China back into Iran's own program as those countries continue refining their own drone warfare doctrine on battlefields like Ukraine. If any piece of that transfer included meshed networking technology or the kind of swarm coordination software that's been maturing rapidly in other conflicts around the world, that would meaningfully close the gap between what most Western intelligence assessments previously credited Iran with and what this pilot may have actually witnessed. This is also a good moment to mention that if you're finding this level of detail useful, hitting subscribe means you won't miss how this story develops, because between the unresolved verification question and the broader arms race it's triggered, this is very much still an unfolding situation rather than a closed case. Let's widen the lens and put this into the broader context of where drone swarm technology has actually been heading across the entire world, because Iran wouldn't be operating in isolation here, even if the account turns out to be fully accurate. Drone swarm technology, and specifically meshed networking that allows large numbers of unmanned systems to coordinate as a single adaptive whole, has been one of the most closely watched frontiers in military technology for the past several years, and multiple major powers have been racing toward exactly this capability from different directions. China has already publicly demonstrated large-scale coordinated drone swarms in exercises, technology sophisticated enough that prominent voices in the tech industry have openly criticized traditional manned fighter programs as outdated by comparison, arguing that investing further in expensive manned platforms while adversaries' perfect, cheap, coordinated autonomous drone swarms represents a fundamentally backwards allocation of defense spending. Whether or not you agree with that framing, it reflects a genuinely serious and increasingly mainstream debate happening inside defense circles right now about whether the age of the dominant manned fighter jet is entering its twilight, at least as the primary tool for winning contested airspace against a genuinely networked and coordinated drone threat. And it's not just China pushing this frontier forward either. The war in Ukraine has become an enormous real-world laboratory for exactly this category of technology, with both Russian and Ukrainian forces racing to field increasingly autonomous, increasingly networked drone systems out of sheer battlefield necessity, refining mesh networking, autonomous target recognition, and swarm coordination software under actual combat conditions, rather than in a lab or controlled testing range. That's an important detail because it means the underlying building blocks for exactly the kind of capability described in the jellyfish account. Drone-to-drone communication, distributed coordination, resilience against individual units being shot down have already been demonstrated and refined in a completely different conflict, proving the core technology isn't some far-off theoretical concept, but something that's already been fielded, tested, and improved under real fire elsewhere in the world. Given how closely Iran, Russia, and to a lesser extent China have all been intertwined on drone technology transfer throughout this broader period, it would be more surprising if none of those battlefield lessons from Ukraine ever made their way into Iran's own program than if some meaningful piece of that knowledge eventually did. And the American response to that broader trend has already been well underway before this specific jellyfish account ever surfaced. The Pentagon has been pushing hard on its own version of coordinated unmanned aircraft, generally referred to as collaborative combat aircraft, drones designed specifically to fly alongside manned fighters as what's often called loyal wingmen, extending sensor coverage, absorbing risk, and adding additional strike capacity without putting more pilots directly in harm's way. The logic behind that program has always been built around the recognition that future contested airspace is going to be dense with autonomous and semi-autonomous systems on both sides, and that a manned fighter operating completely alone, without any kind of coordinated unmanned support around it, is going to be at a growing disadvantage as adversaries field their own increasingly networked drone capabilities. If Iran really has managed to field even an early, imperfect version of coordinated swarm technology, it validates that broader strategic direction, rather than representing some kind of shocking, unprecedented leap that catches American doctrine flat-footed, even if it does mean the timeline for facing that threat operationally has arrived faster, and from a less expected direction than most planners had assumed. And that shift toward taking coordinated swarms seriously as a threat category is already reshaping how defense against them is being approached from a technical standpoint, which is worth walking through because it explains exactly why Emma Bates framed the cost of countering this kind of threat in such stark terms. Traditional air defense is built almost entirely around engaging individual targets. One radar track, one missile, one intercept, a doctrine that works reasonably well against a handful of incoming threats, but starts to break down mathematically against a genuinely coordinated swarm numbering in the dozens or hundreds, where you simply run out of interceptors and tracking channels faster than the swarm runs out of drones. Countering that kind of threat effectively requires a completely different toolkit. Directed energy weapons capable of engaging multiple targets rapidly and cheaply enough that the cost per shot doesn't bankrupt the defender. Electronic warfare systems capable of jamming or spoofing the mesh network itself rather than engaging each drone individually. And increasingly, using coordinated drone defenders of your own to physically intercept incoming swarms before they ever reach a valuable target. Every one of those approaches is significantly more complex and significantly more expensive to field at scale than traditional missile-based air defense, which is exactly the enormous sums and enormous resources Bates was referring to. And it's a large part of why a credible report of even an early, imperfect Iranian swarm capability lands with this much weight inside defense planning circles, regardless of whether the specific jellyfish account itself is ever fully verified. Now, here's the honesty check that really needs to anchor how you think about this entire story, because it would be easy to walk away from all of this convinced Iran has fielded some kind of unstoppable robotic superweapon, and that's simply not where the actual evidence sits right now. What we have is a single, unverified account from one pilot, relayed secondhand through 4 sources describing a debrief rather than a direct, on-record statement, describing something visually and conceptually alarming enough that it triggered a serious internal debate, but nothing close to confirmed, repeatable, independently verified proof of an operational meshed drone swarm capability. There's a competing, entirely plausible alternative explanation for how the aircraft was actually brought down that has nothing to do with any drone swarm at all. There's no public satellite imagery, no recovered wreckage analysis, no captured hardware, and no independent confirmation from any source outside that original debrief that's been made public. Extraordinary claims, especially ones this visually dramatic and this well-suited to going viral, deserve real scrutiny before they get treated as settled fact. And the most responsible read of everything available right now is that this remains a genuinely open, unresolved question rather than a confirmed new chapter in Iranian military capability. There's also a psychological and perceptual angle here worth taking seriously, because it cuts toward genuine skepticism without dismissing the pilot's account as somehow dishonest or unreliable. Ejecting from a burning aircraft over hostile territory, then evading capture or being rapidly extracted under extreme stress is about as intense a set of conditions as a human being can experience. And memory formed under that kind of adrenaline and danger is well documented in psychological research to be vivid, emotionally powerful, and genuinely felt, while also sometimes being distorted in specific, predictable ways, particularly around spatial relationships, timing, and the precise number and arrangement of objects observed in a brief, chaotic window. None of that means the pilot didn't see drones. Multiple accounts and even the competing missile explanation both acknowledge Iranian drone activity was plausible in that airspace at that time. What it does mean is that the specific, almost architecturally precise jellyfish shape, tentacles, layered formation could plausibly be the mind's way of imposing order and pattern onto a genuinely chaotic, high-stress visual experience, a phenomenon psychologists have documented in other high-stress combat and accident scenarios going back decades, without that in any way meaning the underlying drones themselves weren't real or weren't operating together to some degree. That's precisely why intelligence officials take an account like this seriously enough to investigate thoroughly, while still withholding full confirmation until better evidence exists, because human perception under combat stress is a genuinely difficult thing to fully trust on its own, even when the person reporting it is entirely credible and entirely sincere about what they believe they experienced. That said, and this is the part that makes the story worth taking seriously, even amid all that uncertainty, the reason this account spread as fast and as far as it did inside defense circles isn't because people are gullible. It's because the underlying capability being described is entirely plausible, given where drone technology as a whole has been heading globally, and given Iran's documented years of heavy investment in unmanned systems, combined with reported technical relationships with countries that are themselves pushing the frontier on exactly this kind of coordination technology. The account didn't get taken seriously because it sounded believable in isolation. It got taken seriously because it fits a trajectory that serious analysts have been watching develop for years across multiple countries. And Iran suddenly showing up somewhere on that trajectory, even earlier or more dramatically than expected, wouldn't actually be shocking in the way the jellyfish framing makes it feel on first read. There's also a regional dimension to this that's worth considering, because Iran fielding even the early stages of coordinated swarm technology wouldn't just be an American problem. It would ripple outward to every regional partner and every neighboring military currently watching this conflict closely. Gulf states that have spent years and enormous sums building up conventional air defense networks designed around intercepting individual missiles and drones would suddenly need to reassess whether those systems can handle a genuinely coordinated adaptive swarm attack rather than a scattered barrage of individually targeted threats. Israel, which has arguably the most experience of any regional military in rapidly adapting layered air defense against exactly the kind of saturation drone and missile attacks Iran has favored throughout this conflict, would likely be looking at this account just as closely as American analysts, given how directly it would affect defensive planning against Iran's broader arsenal going forward. And it's worth remembering that whatever technology Iran may or may not have fielded here doesn't stay neatly contained to Iran's own military either, given Tehran's long history of transferring drone technology and expertise to allied and proxy forces across the region, from Yemen to Iraq to Lebanon, which means a confirmed swarm capability wouldn't just change how pilots fly over Iranian airspace specifically. It would eventually reshape how every force operating anywhere near Iran's broader network of allies and proxies has to think about the airspace above them too. Let's talk about what actually happens next with this story, because there are really only a few ways this resolves from here. One path is further corroboration, additional pilots, additional debriefs, satellite imagery, captured hardware, or some other independent evidence eventually surfaces that either confirms coordinated mesh networking was genuinely present in that airspace or definitively rules it out in favor of the more conventional missile explanation. Given how closely intelligence agencies track exactly this kind of technical question, especially with active combat operations still ongoing in the region, it's reasonable to expect more clarity eventually emerges one way or another, even if it takes months rather than days. Another path is that this simply stays permanently ambiguous, one of those wartime accounts that never gets fully resolved either way, folded into the broader historical record of the conflict as an unverified but influential report that shaped defense planning, regardless of whether it was ever definitively proven true. And a third path, arguably the most important one regardless of how the first two resolve, is that the mere possibility this represents has already changed behavior inside the Pentagon and among allied militaries, accelerating investment in counter-swarm technology and coordinated unmanned aircraft programs simply because the cost of being wrong, of dismissing a real capability as a false alarm, is so much higher than the cost of investing seriously in defenses against a threat that turns out to have been overstated. That last point is really the strategic heart of why this story matters, regardless of whether the jellyfish account ever gets fully verified. Modern military planning increasingly has to account for capabilities before they're fully proven, because waiting for absolute certainty before responding to a plausible emerging threat is exactly how militaries get caught flat-footed by adversaries willing to move fast and accept a higher tolerance for unproven, imperfect technology fielded under real combat pressure. Iran has shown a consistent pattern throughout this entire conflict of leaning heavily into asymmetric, unconventional approaches, specifically because it can't compete with the United States and its allies on conventional terms. And a genuinely coordinated, self-organizing drone swarm would fit that pattern about as well as any capability Iran could possibly develop. A way to threaten billion-dollar aircraft and highly trained pilots using a fraction of the cost and a fundamentally different kind of technological bet. Whether or not this specific incident turns out to be the proof of that bet paying off, the broader direction it points toward, cheap, networked, adaptive, autonomous systems, increasingly capable of threatening the most expensive and sophisticated platforms in the sky, is a trend that isn't going away regardless of how this one story resolves. And that trend cuts both ways strategically too, because the same cost logic that makes swarm drones attractive to a resource-constrained power like Iran is exactly why the United States and its allies have been pouring increasing investment into their own coordinated drone programs, recognizing that the side which masters cheap, networked, expendable systems first rather than simply the side with the most expensive individual platforms, may end up holding the real advantage in whatever the next phase of contested airspace looks like. So where does that leave things right now? It leaves you with a documented, sourced account from a credible combat debrief that intelligence officials themselves reportedly struggled to fully process, sitting alongside a real, unresolved alternative explanation, wrapped inside a broader global context where the underlying technology being described is entirely plausible and actively being pursued by multiple major militaries around the world. It's a story that deserves genuine attention without sliding into either extreme, treating it as confirmed proof of some unstoppable new Iranian superweapon on one side, or dismissing it entirely as internet hype with no substance behind it on the other. The truth almost certainly sits somewhere in between, and the honest answer, as unsatisfying as it might be, is that we simply don't know yet with full certainty, and probably won't for a while longer, since the kind of definitive proof that would settle this one way or another, recovered hardware, corroborating sensor data, and independently confirmed technical assessment, tends to take considerably longer to surface publicly than the original viral account ever did. What do you think actually happened in the skies over central Iran that day? Do you think this pilot genuinely witnessed an emerging Iranian breakthrough in coordinated drone warfare? Or do you think this account is more likely a combination of combat stress, disorientation, and a coincidental drone presence that got dramatically reinterpreted after the fact? Let us know what you think down in the comments, because the range of informed opinion on this one is genuinely wide, even among people who follow this stuff closely for a living. And hearing how people outside the defense world weigh the same evidence is honestly one of the more interesting parts of covering a story like this. And if stories like this, the ones that sit right at the messy intersection of confirmed fact and unresolved speculation, are the kind of analysis you want more of, go ahead and subscribe and share this with anyone who's been trying to separate the real signal from the noise in all the coverage of this conflict. Because there's a lot of noise out there right now, and not nearly enough careful sorting of what's actually been confirmed versus what's still genuinely up in the air. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep following this one closely as more information hopefully comes to light, because a story this consequential, sitting at the intersection of confirmed combat loss and unconfirmed technological breakthrough, deserves exactly that kind of continued attention rather than a single viral moment and then silence.